Hello and welcome to Let's Discuss Netochka Nezvanova by Fyodor Dostoevsky. In what follows, I will address the background of the novel, give a plot summary, and then explore some of its thematic features. Feel free to jump around using the contents in the video description below. But first, I'd like to say a quick word on the nature of this video itself. If you are familiar with this channel, then you know that I typically offer Let's Reads of Dostoevsky's works, where I read through the novel or short story while offering introductory and concluding thoughts, as well as occasional clarifying comments within the text. In fact, several months ago, I somewhat hesitatingly created a Let's Read of Netochka Nezvanova. The primary source of my hesitation was that this novel has a female first-person narrator, and so it is clearly best voiced by a woman. But since there was, to my knowledge, no other free audiobook of the work out there in English, I decided to go ahead and fill that void. In the months since I released that Let's Read, my doubts have been confirmed. The analytics show that while a very few number of viewers stick with it, the vast majority abandon it before making it 2 minutes into the first chapter, which is far and away the worst retention for any of my projects. Since it appears to make a bad impression, I have decided to replace it with its Let's Discuss instead, which contains the bulk of my commentary from that Let's Read, but omits the actual audiobook. If you do wish to listen to the full Let's Read, I have made the link to it available in the video description below. It's not searchable to the public, but the project is still there, and you may feel free to bookmark it if you wish. What I say here will borrow heavily from that Let's Read. The version of the novel that we have today was edited in 1860, after Dostoevsky had returned from his exile to Siberia. However, it was originally written more than a decade earlier, during the early period of the author's career. He developed the idea for the novel in 1846, but serial installments did not begin to appear in print until 1849. However, writing on the novel was cut short by his arrest on political charges in the April of 1849, and so it was never finished. While editing the work years later, Dostoevsky trimmed some of the content but added nothing, and so it remains incomplete. Even making allowances for its unfinished status, the novel is unquestionably rough around the edges, as the young author was still attempting to find his footing after a series of critical setbacks. And yet Netochka Nezvanova is the most ambitious project of Dostoevsky's early career. The extant portions of the novel were originally conceived as an introduction to a much longer work. The narrative genre that Dostoevsky is employing is the Bildungsroman, which translated from the German means a novel of education. That is, the story of the development and life of a character as narrated by that character in his or her maturity. We should imagine that our narrator is Netochka in her later years, recalling her life story. As it turns out, the novel traces her biography into her late teens before it suddenly ends. The work is unique in a number of respects. It is the first Russian novel dedicated to the childhood of its protagonist, preceding Tolstoy's trilogy, Childhood, Boyhood, and Youth, by just a handful of years. It is the only work where Dostoevsky wrote entirely from the perspective of a woman. It is also his only attempt at a Bildungsroman, and the only lengthy work of his to take its title from the name of its main character. Curiously, though, the surname Nezvanova never appears in the actual text. The word translates as nameless, although it could also be construed as uninvited or unloved. The name Netochka is a diminutive form of Anna, first applied to her by her mother. By the time Dostoevsky was writing Netochka Nezvanova, the Bildungsroman had fallen out of fashion. However, just as he employed the outmoded epistolary novel in Poor Folk, and just as he used the outmoded doppelganger fiction in The Double, here Dostoevsky is attempting to revitalize an old genre while providing his own unique twist to it. In fact, in this early experimental period of his career, there was very little that he wouldn't try. At times in this period, he imitates the voice of Gogol or Pushkin. At times he takes on Russian folk tales. At one point he apes Paul de Kock's farcical stories, and so on, shifting styles while attempting to establish himself. In this case, scholars claim that his style imitates the work of George Sand, whom he admired greatly. George Sand being the pen name for the French female writer and political commentator. In the process, he seems to be attempting to tap into two issues that would have been front of mind at the time: the so-called woman question and the proper role of art. In this case, I think it's safe to say that his experiment was a failure, and that Netochka Nezvanova falls short as a work of literature. And yet it still captures significant attention from Dostoevsky scholars, primarily because of its critical role in understanding the development of the author. Netochka Nezvanova is an important milestone in the author's shift away from a social focus to a psychological one, where the primary locus of moral responsibility is on the individual rather than on societal structures. For the rest of us, the allure of the novel comes from some brilliant psychological portraits and unforgettable scenes. Early on, we are introduced to one of Dostoevsky's first fully developed and engrossing portrayals of a scoundrel. Later, we come across an unexpected and unexpectedly steamy relationship making a surprising appearance in 19th century literature. The novel ends in one of those explosive scandal scenes that would prove to be such a characteristic feature of Dostoevsky's mature works. And there are moments in these pages that compose something of a psychoanalyst's playground. All this takes place in 7 chapters, which narrate 3 different episodes in the life of young Netochka. These episodes aren't labeled as such in the table of contents or in chapter headings, but they are unmistakable as you read along and observe as Netochka's living situation shifts from one home to another. In the next half hour or so, I'll give a fairly detailed synopsis of the plot, and so expect spoilers ahead. Of course, you might want to read the book yourself. One inexpensive way of doing so is by purchasing a Kindle edition of the complete works of Dostoevsky through Amazon. An even less expensive way would be to check out the Let's Read, accessible through a link in the video description. But just be prepared to listen to me talking like a woman for 9 hours, as well as an amateurish effort at a German dialect in places. The first episode surrounds Netochka's relationship with her stepfather, whom she assumes during this period of her childhood is her natural father. The first chapter tells his backstory, of which Netochka herself discovers only much later on in life. The man's name is Yefimov, and he starts out as a clarinetist in a provincial landowner's private orchestra. However, this clarinetist winds up with the possession of a violin, which had originally been owned by the conductor of a neighboring count's orchestra. This conductor loses his job, pals around with Yefimov, appears to have some strange influence over him, and dies under mysterious circumstances, bequeathing his violin to Yefimov in the process. The violin itself is desired by others who offer to pay Yefimov for it, but the man refuses to sell, suddenly convinced that he is actually a musical genius with the violin, and now certain that the kindly landowner has been shackling his talents by forcing him to play the clarinet. Surprisingly, he manages to convince a distinguished visiting French violinist of this narrative, slandering both the landowner and the count in the process, before opting to leave his original place in the orchestra and striking out on his own with his newly adopted instrument. As it turns out, this narrative of being a musical genius takes a morbid hold over Yefimov. For several years, he bounces around various gigs with low-level orchestras in the provinces, but can't hold down any position because he views these jobs as beneath him. Finally, he makes his way to Petersburg, where he had hoped his career would take off. Indeed, it probably could have, except that his own dissolute ways and outrageous arrogance interfere with his prospects. At this point, Yefimov is contrasted with his new roommate, a German immigrant we know only by the initial B, and who also has aspirations with the violin. But B works diligently at his craft and is willing slowly to climb the ladder of success. Yefimov, however, clings to the image of his former musical brilliance, refuses to take advantage of low-level opportunities, and squanders his talent. Ultimately, Yefimov becomes utterly dependent upon B to support him, finally exhausting the kindly German's patience, and they separate. When they run into each other years later, B discovers that Yefimov, who now appears to be little more than a drunken beggar, has married a widow, the mother of Netochka, who herself had been seduced by the image of Yefimov's musical genius. Yefimov, however, had simply spent all his bride's money, then folded his hands and refused to work, on the pretext that he simply could not do music in the confines of his garret with his impoverished family. Convincing himself that his wife has been the ruin of him, Yefimov now becomes entirely dependent upon her, and she slips into chronic illness, attempting to support the family of three with various odd jobs, such as doing washing or making meals for neighbors. At one point, B attempts to relieve the agony of this family by finding a job in an orchestra for Yefimov, but after a short time he squanders this chance as well through drunkenness and negligence, and ends up spending his days as a kind of witty buffoon in the tavern, casting entertaining but spiteful criticism at the musicians in town for the benefit of those who egg him on with an offer of drink. This is the miserable domestic situation of the young Netochka, who appears to come to self-awareness in Chapter 2 at the age of 9. Cramped in that little garret in Petersburg, she has very little to do but to stare about her, and her careworn mother, enfeebled as she is both by illness and the burdens of supporting a family, can spare little energy for acts of affection toward her daughter. But after a marital dispute between her parents, when the mother is out, Yefimov, whom she takes to be her natural father, calls Netochka over, hugs and caresses her, and immediately gains her love and loyalty. This love gradually takes on a strange and intense dynamic. At one point, our narrator calls it a motherly love, as the young Netochka is preternaturally aware that her father is a wretched man in need of care. And yet her love becomes a passionate obsession, with at least a hint of an erotic flavor. She spends her days dreaming of him, waiting for him to come home in the cold, eager to do anything to please him, and, quote, almost frantic with delight when he bestowed the slightest caress." Unquote. This obsession develops in ways that distort Netochka's understanding of her environment and of her duties. Caught up in the friction between her mother and her father, she feels that she has to choose between them, and chooses the one who has shown her affection. As a result, she naturally absorbs Yefimov's belief that her mother is actually a roadblock to his great success as a musical genius, and unjustly develops a kind of hatred for her mother. She becomes fascinated with a nearby grand house with red curtains, which she can see from her window, and fantasizes that it is a place of great happiness and luxury, eventually fixing upon the idea that once her mother died, her father would become a great artist, and they would go to live in that house. When she inadvertently reveals this deeply held fantasy later, Yefimov is surprised and scolds her for it. And yet he perpetuates the idea that the two of them will one day be rich when he becomes a famous musician. Further, he enlists Netochka to steal money from her mother when she is out on an errand to purchase something, and then drinks the money away at the tavern. These events come to a head in the 3rd chapter, when a world-class violinist whom we know as S arrives in Petersburg. Yefimov feels threatened by this arrival, as S's superiority with the violin will prove hard to dismiss with his acerbic criticism in the tavern, and, exposed to the brilliance of S, Yefimov's cherished idea of his own musical dominance will prove hard to preserve even in his own mind. But Yefimov becomes desperate to see his performance in order to settle his own inner turmoil, and so pines after tickets that he cannot afford. But where to get the money for the ticket? He knows of exactly one person who would do anything for him, and in a couple of different episodes imposes upon Netochka to steal from her mother so he can spend the 15 rubles, which would be very dear to that family, on his ticket. On the night of the concert, Netochka, in anguish, steals the money, knowing the hardship it will cause. But the plot is uncovered by the mother, and an intense altercation with Yefimov is about to explode, when they receive a knock on the door, and a footman delivers a ticket to the concert as a gift from the violinist B. And so Yefimov gets his chance after all. With Yefimov gone at the concert, the enfeebled and agitated mother embraces her daughter, and they share a moment of intimacy, as the mother confesses her despair over what will happen to Netochka upon her death. In fact, her death comes that very night. Netochka wakes up in the night to see her father sitting silently in the room, and then go to check on his motionless wife. He covers her from head to toe with a quilt, starts to pack his belongings as though going on a journey, pulls out his old violin, and then attempts to play, presumably imitating what he has heard at the concert. The music sounds monstrous to Netochka, who bounds out of bed to run to her father. She instinctually implores him to take her with him and to leave the garret, but is confused about what has happened to her mother. Yefimov agrees, but requires her first to kneel down and pray before the icon. When she asks about her mother, Yefimov shows her the body under the quilt, insisting emphatically that her death was not his doing. In terror, Netochka urges her father for them to leave immediately, and they do so. But Yefimov has absolutely no desire to be saddled with the care of this girl. When they reach the frozen canal, and Netochka worries about the fact that they have simply abandoned her mother's body, Yefimov encourages her to go back alone and to fetch someone to care for it. But the moment her back is turned, he bolts in the opposite direction. Netochka, seeing this, chases after him, but collapses in despair and exhaustion in the streets of the city, having lost the only person who ever loved her, and having been abandoned by the only person she ever loved. As luck would have it, however, the place where she faints is at the gates of the kindly Prince X, a friend of the violinist B, who takes her into his happy home as the first episode draws to a close. The second episode describes Netochka's life in this new household. It is complicated by the fact that it comes in two versions. In the original 1849 text, there is a subplot about another orphan who lives with Prince X, a boy named Laria. Laria is described as a boy who had been bullied by his schoolmates while his parents were alive, and who took out his anger on his parents by tormenting them as a problem child. One Christmas Eve, his father dies of a heart attack, after Laria had made demands of expensive presents that he could not afford, and his mother dies soon thereafter. Laria becomes convinced that he has caused his parents' death, and spends his days in Prince X's house, brooding in guilt, crying, and withdrawing from all productive activities and social contact. When Dostoevsky edited the novel in 1860, he cut out this subplot, presumably believing it to be an unnecessary distraction from what he was trying to accomplish. The standard version of the novel available today won't mention it. Rather, what we discover in Chapter 4 is a roster of characters that includes Prince X, his wife, his old aunt, his daughter Katya, and his grown and married stepdaughter Alexandra Mihailovna. The household also includes a governess named Madame Lyotard. As of Chapter 4, Katya and Alexandra are away visiting relatives in Moscow. Netochka takes a while to warm up to her new environment. While she has escaped poverty, she has also lost her loved ones and has suffered a severe shock. And while Prince X is genuinely interested in her welfare, his wife appears to be interested in her only as a curiosity for drawing-room talk and aristocratic social gatherings. But Netochka hasn't been trained for this kind of interaction, and she fails at conversation both in private with the wife and also with the gentry who come to visit. At first, these visitors are entertained by the sentimental tale that their hostess tells of her new lodger. But since Netochka herself is unable to say anything interesting, these visits gradually become stale, and the middle-aged princess loses interest in the orphan girl altogether. Things are no better with the old princess of the house, the aunt of Prince X. This spinster is pious and severe, demands strict obedience to the canons of propriety and etiquette, and has most everyone in the household under her domineering thumb, despite being sequestered in her rooms in the upper story of the house night and day. At length she asks to see young Netochka, but of course Netochka fails at all the social niceties and is dismissed as something of a young savage. Two other painful events occur in this chapter. At one point, Prince X sympathetically refers to Netochka as a poor little orphan, and Netochka recoils at this label, denying that she is an orphan, and searching around for her mother. The prince brings her to the icon to pray, but this only makes things worse, because it triggers memories of the last time she had prayed before the icon, over the dead body of her mother. Later on, the violinist S is invited to perform at an evening party. Netochka wakes up in the night, creeps down the stairs to the big drawing room, the entrance of which is draped with red curtains. Inside, she encounters the crowd listening to S's violin, which issues music that sounds familiar to Netochka. I speculate that this is the same song that Yefimov had attempted to imitate in his garret in Chapter 3, although this is not made explicit. Regardless, Netochka appears to believe for a moment that she has arrived in the house with the red curtains and is watching her masterful father play. She rushes up to the musician, calling him Daddy, before reality crashes in on her and she faints. When she regains consciousness, the first thing she sees is the beautiful face of the young princess, Katya, the daughter of Prince X. Katya is of an age with Netochka, and she is the center of attention for the 5th chapter. Katya is a boisterous, carefree girl, and thus quite a foil to the quiet and timid Netochka. Katya expects Netochka to be her playmate, and is disappointed when Netochka is slow to recover, when she doesn't know how to play games, when she is quiet, and when she is mournful. And yet Netochka is fascinated by the girl, thinking about her night and day, at one point kissing her in the middle of a game. Katya does not reciprocate this fascination, at least not outwardly. In fact, she shows enough scorn toward Netochka that she is scolded by Madame Leotard, the governess, and is required to make it up with her. She does so, and during their subsequent conversation, invites Netochka to kiss her as a way of cheering her up. And yet there are further moments of conflict between them. Later on, Netochka outperforms Katya at their French lessons, and Madame Leotard scolds Katya for her laziness. Katya responds by coming up to Netochka hours later and observing ways in which Netochka is inferior to her. She can't dance or play the piano, for instance. This earns her another scolding from the governess. After 2 days of silence, she approaches Netochka again and asks further questions about why she is always crying, about her mother and father, about her former poverty, driving Netochka to tears. This time the prince intervenes, and Katya earns her most severe reprimand yet when she refuses to apologize. After 3 more frosty days of silence, Katya finally approaches Netochka with another apology, and seems to be suffering from some constrained emotion as she does so. In the following days, she remains distant from Netochka, but is interested in her, observing her. Shortly thereafter, however, as though she has satisfied her curiosity about her, she decides to shun her altogether. And yet, days later, there is another episode between the two. Katya, the boisterous little tyrant of the house, wants to have everyone in the family under her sway, including the vicious family dog, Falstaff, despite Falstaff's tendency to bite anyone who disturbs him. One day, Katya makes several advances on the bulldog, trying several strategies to gain his trust, but is rebuffed each time by a threatening growl and a baring of teeth. But Katya, upon seeing Netochka observing her, flushes and marches up to Falstaff, ignoring his threats, and strokes his back, looking at Netochka triumphantly. By this point, Netochka's infatuation is becoming abnormally intense, as she would steal a ribbon that Katya wears in her hair and kiss it, or would kiss her hands while she is sleeping. Further, something is clearly happening from Katya's end as well, as she starts to go through erratic moods, seals herself in her mother's room with a sudden fever, and then, upon getting better, oscillates from wild to dreamy. Finally, Katya breaks the ice, suddenly offering to tie Netochka's shoe and then to tie up her neckerchief. A moment later, as they climb the stairs, Netochka stealthily kisses her on the shoulder. The next day, Katya is completely out of order and pulls an outrageous prank on her old great-aunt, opening up the door to her rooms and letting in the dog, who immediately leaps at the chance at terrorizing the screaming old lady. In the resulting inquisition, just when Katya's mother is about to accuse her daughter of the prank and to mete out justice, Netochka takes the blame by offering a false confession. Her punishment, a 4-hour confinement in an empty room. However, due to a mix-up among the adults, Netochka is left in confinement until 4 in the morning. It is Katya who discovers the mistake when she wakes up in the early morning to see that Netochka had not come to bed. She alerts the adults, who are properly horrified and rescue the orphan. But this event is the final tipping point. The following evening, after dinner in the drawing room, Katya bursts into a brief moment of hysterics and kisses Netochka. That night, as they undress for bed, the dam bursts altogether. Once the maid is out of the room, Katya urges Netochka to sleep in her own bed, and a great deal of hugging and kissing ensues. It is prepubescent, and so not sexual per se, but it is unquestionably an erotic encounter. And the eroticism takes on a curious flavor. During their pillow talk, Katya reveals that she has hovered between loving Netochka and hating her, that she has often wanted to torment her, and then that she has thought that she would either kiss Netochka or wind up pinching her to death. And then she teaches Netochka to pinch her, to call her an idiot, and then makes up a new rule that in the future they would take turns at the roles of master and slave, Katya giving the orders one day and Netochka the next. But the two are in raptures in each other's arms. Yet it all ends swiftly. As the days pass with the two girls giddy in each other's presence and stealing kisses when they think they are alone, reports of their behavior make their way to Katya's mother. She immediately attempts to put an end to it by separating the two girls. And shortly thereafter, the whole family is required to move to Moscow because of an illness of a relation there. Netochka is left behind in Petersburg in the care of Alexandra Mihailovna, the grown daughter of Katya's mother by her first husband. Once again, she must get used to an entirely new living situation. It is in this new home that Netochka grows to womanhood. Chapter 6 gives a summary of the broad outline of her development there, mostly under the watchful eye of her new mother figure. Alexandra Mihailovna's character is rather like Netochka's own. She is intelligent and artistically inclined, but also meek and timid, and very much under the sway of her husband. Some scholars argue that the similarity between these two figures is part of what bogs down the third episode, which tends to be the least popular of the three and attracts the least attention. Nevertheless, Alexandra Mihailovna proves to be a remarkable teacher. She comes to believe that traditional methods of instruction are inadequate, and she adopts something like a Socratic method, posing problems for Netochka to solve on her own, and having her come to an in-depth knowledge of a subject in this more effortful but fruitful way. Further, when her paid tutors bore Netochka to tears with a dry litany of facts, Alexandra reteaches the lesson through the medium of imaginative stories. And she also takes it upon herself to open the world of literature to Netochka, introducing her to Walter Scott's Ivanhoe when she is 16. In this, however, she is too late. For years earlier, Netochka had discovered a key to the family library, which had been locked up and never used. She had secretly kept that key to herself, and had been surreptitiously reading the novels it had contained for years, greedily absorbing their contents. All this only fuels her already rich, imaginative life. She also discovers a new ability during these years. One evening, while Alexandra Mikhailovna is playing at the piano, Netochka begins singing along, surprising both Alexandra and herself with the beauty of her voice. When the musician B is summoned to appraise her singing, he endorses her as a great talent, and she begins taking lessons at a Petersburg conservatory. This chapter also hints at a strained relationship between Alexandra Mikhailovna and her husband, Pyotr Alexandrovich. Netochka notices early on that, however sunny she may seem on the surface, Alexandra carries with her an undercurrent of a deep unhappiness. Her husband is a dry and severe businessman who, contra his wife, often appears in society and is respected by everyone. During their times together, Alexandra would be almost morbidly eager to please him and would worry about any hint of disapproval in his voice or demeanor. On his part, when his wife would timorously make some request, Pyotr would sometimes respond with a condescending smile, as though indulging a child. At other times, he would pull up, as though involuntarily remembering something painful, take on a gloomy air of a martyr, and then abandon the room, leaving Alexandra Mikhailovna to burst into tears. As the years pass, this depression is only exacerbated by Alexandra Mikhailovna's declining health. By the time Chapter 7 opens, and the 17-year-old Netochka unlocks the mystery of this marital dynamic, Alexandra is perilously ill and would be unlikely to survive a serious shock. The revelation occurs when Netochka is on one of her clandestine trips to the library. When she opens up a copy of Scott's novel, St. Ronan's Well, she discovers a letter that had been hidden in its pages. It is a lengthy and heart-rending farewell note from a man who once was Alexandra Mikhailovna's lover. The backstory appears to be that, years before Netochka's arrival in the household, the married Alexandra had another admirer, and in their chaste encounters, Alexandra had come to love him. But a scandal was brewing, and while Pyotr Alexandrovich worked to put it down, the lover had to leave, sending his goodbye in this note. Alexandra had preserved the letter in this secretive way, and her husband had never read it. This prior scandal, apparently, was the event that Pyotr Alexandrovich would sometimes mournfully remember, which in turn would cause such anguish in his wife. But how mournful was the man really? The answer to that question is Netochka's second discovery. It comes after a lengthy period during which Netochka agonizes over what to do with her newfound knowledge. She is immediately disposed to be sympathetic to Alexandra Mikhailovna, and is tempted at times to reveal her discovery to her in an attempt to comfort her. But she is dissuaded by the knowledge of how much damage the shock could do her. and she is immediately disposed not to be sympathetic with the stern and domineering husband. This instinct is only reinforced by an episode when, while on an errand to deliver some message to Pyotr Alexandrovitch, she goes into his study and finds it to be empty. She takes the opportunity to examine his portrait on the wall, and is revolted by the apparent lying and duplicity in his eyes. But Pyotr Alexandrovitch walks in on her and scolds her harshly. Days later, her suspicions are confirmed. When on an errand to Alexandra Mikhailovna's study, she observes Pyotr Alexandrovitch approaching the same destination from a different direction. Netochka watches him, unobserved, as he very uncharacteristically hums a merry tune and adjusts his hair in the mirror outside of his wife's study. This observation triggers a memory from years earlier when a younger Netochka observed the exact same thing. A very pleased Pyotr Alexandrovitch adjusting his appearance before the glass, before deliberately donning a contrived melancholy appearance with which to approach his wife. The reader is expected to understand his antics immediately. Pyotr Alexandrovitch has not actually been wounded by his wife's innocent flirtation those many years ago. Rather, he has been leveraging this episode as a way to oppress his wife and to assume moral authority over her. Netochka responds to this sudden discovery with a nervous, hysterical laugh. Pyotr Alexandrovitch is taken aback and looks at her with fury, and we observe a silent declaration of war. Half an hour later, Pyotr walks in on a meeting between the two women of the house and rudely demands to know why Netochka is blushing and stammering. Alexandra Mikhailovna stands up for her, accusing Pyotr of being the cause of both women's blushing for shame over him, to which he callously responds, quote, "Do you mean to tell me I can make you blush for me? It's for you to blush, not for me, don't you think?" With these shots fired, Netochka is dismissed as a private marital discussion ensues. The following day, Alexandra Mikhailovna is initially cold toward Netochka, but gradually warms up. Multiple times she asks if Netochka had something on her mind that she wished to confess. Netochka denies that she does. Later we get a hint of what Alexandra might be thinking. During that private conversation with Pyotr, she had accused him of looking with a predatory eye upon Netochka, and might therefore be wondering if her husband had made a pass at her. With her doubts relieved, she and Netochka have intimate conversation as she talks about her likely death, in a way that roughly parallels the conversation between Netochka and her natural mother in Chapter 3. The climax to the episode occurs the following day. Netochka is in the library idly perusing the old letter when Pyotr Alexandrovitch walks in on her and snatches it from her grasp. Netochka snatches it back, but not until Pyotr manages to scan a few lines. He sees that it is a love letter, and immediately assumes that Netochka herself is caught up in some unsavory love affair. In the resulting altercation, Netochka refuses to submit to his authority and goes directly to Alexandra Mikhailovna's study. She immediately regrets the decision, but it is too late. Pyotr descends upon her before she can leave, and now the frail Alexandra is pulled into the standoff. What follows is the most intense verbal dispute of the novel. I won't give a blow-by-blow account, but the main idea is that Netochka is compelled to give confession in 2 stages. The first is that she had secretly gained access to the library and had been using it for years. Alexandra Mikhailovna seems to think that this is no great sin, and that perhaps she herself is to blame for neglecting Netochka's education in recent years, and defends Netochka's honor. But this is too much for Pyotr Alexandrovich, who is desperate to convince his wife of Netochka's wickedness and to defend his own moral superiority, both over the young orphan and over his wife. So he accuses Netochka of having a secret lover, mentioning the letter as evidence. To spare Alexandra Mikhailovna, Netochka confesses. But once again Alexandra defends Netochka and announces that she, too, is a sinner and so cannot throw stones. And then she upbraids her husband for his selfish bullying. Pyotr is about to respond by throwing her prior extramarital romance in her face, but she faints. Hours later, with the doctor in the house, Netochka privately shows the letter to Pyotr and reveals what she knows, while delivering a withering attack on his character and motives. And then the novel suddenly ends, as Dostoevsky is arrested and his work stops. Perhaps it is a good thing that the fragment ends where it does, before this desultory narrative can meander any further. In light of the disconnected nature of the story as a whole, one of the challenges for scholars is to figure out exactly what Dostoevsky was trying to do with this novel. The consensus opinion seems to be, as mentioned earlier, that he was attempting to address two major issues confronting the intelligentsia of his day: the woman question and the art question. This combination of themes prompts Elizabeth Cherish Allen to suggest that a fitting title for the work could easily have been A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Woman. The woman question is addressed most directly in that third episode of the narrative. It's true that we see the tyranny of a man over his wife in the first episode, where Netochka's mother is reduced to poverty, and ultimately a premature death, at the hands of her derelict husband. But the unjust dependency of women on men's industry would be an obvious and common observation of the time. The third episode explores more fully and subtly the depth of the subjection of women in society, even in those stable homes where no one's material welfare is in jeopardy. On the other hand, despite Dostoevsky's intentions, the portrayal of woman in this episode might not be the most flattering, at least for modern readers. Netochka herself has a penchant for weeping, fainting, and nervous attacks. As noted earlier, one of the troubles of the third episode is that Alexandra Mikhailovna is a little too similar in character to Netochka, and so the emotional outbursts tend to multiply, as these two figures will clutch each other in an overflow of sentiment that might test the reader's patience. As we have seen, the key conflict of the episode surrounds what we might call the weaponizing of virtue, where Pyotr Alexandrovich can use his apparent moral uprightness as a bludgeon to beat his wife into subjection. By itself, the weaponizing of virtue is gender-neutral. Connoisseurs of the New Testament can probably rattle off several instances of it from the Gospel's portrayal of Pharisees, some of which have no woman at all. But in the 19th century, as in the first, it is the man who holds the cards. Pyotr Alexandrovich owns the house. He is the one with the business connections. He is the one who holds the esteem of the community. He can manipulate appearances in his favor to the detriment of his wife, and as Netochka observes, he gets perverse enjoyment out of doing so. In fact, Pyotr Alexandrovich is probably not as virtuous as he pretends to be, even in the sexual domain. The text offers clues to suggest that Alexandra Mihailovna's suspicions strike close to home, and that the man really has been looking at Netochka lasciviously. Pyotr gives himself away during a moment when he explains that he had been watching Netochka closely because he was attempting to unmask her. The chronology of the final chapter doesn't seem to add up to that explanation, and so if he was watching her, as he admits, it was with some other interest. Netochka and Alexandra both finally respond to this despotism, Netochka with much more strength. Right in the final pages of the novel, we just begin to see Netochka coming into her own. It's not enough of a glimpse to be fully satisfying, but it's enough to justify Joseph Frank's assertion that Dostoevsky was trying to portray more than just a victim of the injustices of patriarchy, but a character who could overcome it. Probably she was intended to overcome it as a musical artist. And once again, it is in the third episode where we see that development beginning to blossom. But before we get there, we see a more direct discussion of art in the first episode, where we see something of an anti-romantic sally which would have been common by the late 1840s. By the time Dostoevsky was writing this novel, the literati in Russia had turned against the romanticism of the prior generation, and so had turned against the veneration of the aesthetic value of art, in favor of more practical attention to the social problems of the day. Dostoevsky never joined in this chorus with great enthusiasm, and he always valued the role of art, but he did recognize the dangers of idolizing it. In fact, we see him wrestle with this conflict in another work of the same period, White Nights. In the early stages of the novel, the figure Yefimov seems to accentuate the utter self-absorption of the traditional romantic hero, at least as the figure had come to be caricatured at the time. Obsessed by his own genius, his picture of the world simply demands as sacred dogma the idea that he is the greatest living violinist, and he is willing to sacrifice everything, his living conditions, his employment, his relationships, and the welfare of his family, in order to protect it. Anyone familiar with the biography of Dostoevsky as a young man will suspect that there is a little of the author himself in this portrayal. Like Yefimov, Dostoevsky himself was proclaimed to be a genius at his first attempt at his craft. Like Yefimov, his first success went to his head in a way that was insufferable to many of his peers, and like the violinist, he met with subsequent failures that challenged his belief in his own genius. Like Yefimov, he was probably tortured by doubts about his own talents, as indeed most anyone is who has experienced early critical praise. Unlike Yefimov, however, Dostoevsky worked incessantly to pull himself out of his downward spiral, and so valued the sort of behavior that the violinist B models in the first chapter of the novel. And the fact that the novel features the perspective of B at all in this first episode reveals that even at this early stage, the portrayal of art is not wholly negative. B is one of the strongest exemplars of virtue in the text, and articulates the way an artist should properly pursue his or her craft. We are to believe that there is something good about art when it is pursued diligently, with reverence, and without the distraction of one's own conceit getting in the way. But it is not until the third episode that we get a sense of what this good thing might be that art offers. It is only presented indirectly, and it is not even through Netochka's primary art form, but through the imaginative world of stories. But if we look carefully at her maturation during this last episode, we can see the role played by the imagination in her development as a sensitive moral agent. We see throughout the novel that Netochka has a tendency to take flights of fancy and to project her own self into a richer imaginative world of interpersonal interaction. This is, perhaps, one of the telltale indicators of an artistically inclined soul. In the early chapters, this tendency is left unguided, or worse, perverted by the misdeeds of her miscreant stepfather. And so she makes up stories about the house with the red curtains, or of abandoning her mother to run away with her father, and so her imaginative world distorts her moral life. But her education under Alexandra Mikhailovna opens up an entirely different world of imagination for Netochka. As we have seen, Alexandra Mikhailovna makes Netochka's lessons come to life through stories. And once she gains access to the family library, Netochka's imagination receives further guidance under the tutelage of master novelists, of whom Walter Scott seems to be the dominant example. By the time Chapter 7 rolls around, Netochka understands much of the movements of the human soul. And so she can read the letter she stumbles across and recognize the feelings that it contains, and so unlocks the mystery of the human drama of the house. With this heightened sensitivity, she emerges in the final pages of the novel as the strongest moral agent of the household. And so Netochka turns out to be a foil of her stepfather. Both Yefimov and Netochka are dreamers, the former even explicitly labeled one by B early on. But while Yefimov's dreaming leads him to decadence and destruction, Netochka's leads her to virtue, and at least to the cusp of success. And so it is here that we get a possible resolution of a conflict in Dostoevsky's mind about the nature of dreaming that may have begun as early as his 1847 novella The Landlady, and takes center stage in the 1848 story White Nights. Is dreaming a threat to one's virtue? It can be, but it needn't be. As seen in the life of Netochka, it may be a positive good if it is invested in a sensitive understanding of the people around us. At least this is how I understand the overarching themes of the story. But most readers of Netochka Nezvanova are not likely to be as struck by these themes as by the psychological portrayals on display. There are notable psychological devices that Dostoevsky employs here: the narration of a character's first awakening to consciousness, moments of amnesia, or perhaps repressed memories, and then moments of association, where S's playing of the violin appears to cause painful memories of Yefimov's last performance in his garret, or where Prince X's invitation to pray before the icon awakens memories of the fateful night where Yefimov asks Netochka to pray over her mother's corpse. But surely the most notable features of the novel involve the relationships between Netochka and her stepfather, and between Netochka and Katya. The narrative is a noticeably erotic one. While there seems to be nothing erotic between the three married couples on display, eroticism seems to follow Netochka everywhere, even in the third episode, where she is the object and not the subject of such feelings. And it is hard to ignore that this element has a distinctly Freudian flavor. Or perhaps I should say proto-Freudian, since Freud had not yet entered the scene, and indeed was heavily influenced by Dostoevsky. For the uninitiated, one of the Freudian explanations of sexual development goes something like this. A young boy's first encounter with womanhood is with his mother. Naturally, then, his mother is the first object of his sexual desire. His father is thus his first rival, and so the boy has an unconscious urge to murder his father to be with his mother. This is your classical Oedipus complex, and when we invert the genders, we are looking at an Electra complex. Typically, this complex is resolved when the boy successfully identifies with his father, and wanting to be like his father, comes to desire to find a woman of his own, not his mother herself. When this complex is not resolved, the boy continues to suffer from a taboo sexual feeling, and so ultimately experiments with other forms of deviancy, one of which, Freud suggests, is homosexuality. Netochka appears to experience a classical Electra complex in the novel. We have seen how Netochka develops an attachment to her father and an antagonism toward her mother. The passion she feels for her father does have erotic elements. Not only does she obsess all day over him, the first parental caress she remembers comes from him, and she nestles into him when she sits on his lap. Some commentators claim, hyperbolically, that these scenes verge on child pornography. That label is a bit much, and yet the scene certainly fits the Freudian story, as does her attitude toward her mother, where Netochka is led seemingly to wish for her mother's death. Frank suggests that there might be another autobiographical connection here. At a tender age, Dostoevsky himself saw his hopes of pursuing literature undermined by the demand of his father that he embark upon a career as a military engineer. He lost his father prematurely, perhaps to murder at the hands of his own serfs, while still enrolled at the academy and while still on tumultuous terms with him. The feelings of guilt he endured as a result may very well have mirrored what Netochka ultimately experiences at the loss of her mother. Whatever the case, Dostoevsky's relationship with his father was certainly an item of interest for Freud himself, who ultimately wrote an essay on the topic. Of course, Netochka never does successfully identify with her mother, since her mother dies before she can do so, her stepfather shortly thereafter. According to the Freudian account, we should expect her to slip into sexual experimentation, and so her erotic love for Katya is more or less to be expected on this line. Without the guidance of a normative standard, the erotic domain is unmoored from its traditional trappings, and so will find a home wherever it can. At least that's the story. I confess that I do find it just a little too pat. When we try to free ourselves from the psychoanalytic lens and consider the story on its own terms, the reality is that Netochka is an extremely sensitive girl. Katya is the most beautiful human in her world. There is no male of comparable age to rival her, and so we should expect Netochka to be sensitive to her beauty. It is true that in the earlier version of the novel there is the orphan boy named Laria who lives under Prince X's roof, and Netochka's sensitive spirit draws her very deeply into his emotional life. But Laria is a toxic presence who breeds depression. Katya, by contrast, is full of life and energy, and so we should expect her to evoke a different kind of feeling than anyone else in Netochka's life. Is Netochka a lesbian? I hesitate to weigh in on this, and I'm not sure that the text gives a fully determinate answer. On the one hand, even in the third episode, Netochka maintains an affection for Katya which never wavers. Even more, when the mature Netochka as narrator describes the appearance of Alexandra Mikhailovna, her glowing portrayal of her beauty reads like the sort of thing we might expect of a heterosexual man. On the other hand, we are talking about a prepubescent encounter with Katya, and I'm not sure that this sort of thing fully determines the sexual identity of the child going forward. At any rate, it certainly seems like Katya's family doesn't think so. We have seen how Katya's mother immediately steps in to separate the two girls. Later on, when he visits Netochka's new home, the violinist B is reluctant to talk about Katya. We get the impression that the family is attempting to gently steer Katya back in the direction of conventional norms. Perhaps they are successful, for we never do get to see a clear picture of how Katya views Netochka as the years of the third episode roll by. In fact, the whole relationship from Katya's angle seems to have a different dynamic. Why should Katya be taken with Netochka? I would guess that the answer is that Netochka conquers her in a way that she has never been conquered before. Katya rules the household and has everyone but the family dog under her thumb. But Netochka presents a challenge. Here, Katya is presented with a submissive intruder into her life, a girl from an entirely different world, one who, despite her adoration of Katya, never joins in games the way Katya wants or expects, and then unexpectedly outperforms her in a French lesson. Katya feels she has to demonstrate her superiority in some way over Netochka, but the resulting fallout with her father leads to a standoff of multiple days, after which she finally submits and humbly asks for forgiveness. Something about this power dynamic, which hits another high point with her encounter with the dog, is wrapped up in the erotic tension which drives Katya. And when the two lovers find themselves in Katya's bed, the issue of power spills out of Katya's confession, as we have seen. This may be the first instance of the love-hate relationship which becomes such an important element of Dostoevsky's novels going forward. For the person caught in its web, the tension lies between submitting to the other person and dominating him or her. Frank suggests that ultimately this tension takes on a spiritual dimension, concerning whether we can submit to the love of Christ. Certainly we will see other characters like Katya in the novels ahead. Nastasia Philippovna from The Idiot comes to mind. There are other anticipations here, too. Netochka's original home seems similar to the Marmeladov household of Crime and Punishment, in particular with a similarity between Netochka's mother and Katerina Marmeladov. We will see orphans in the novels ahead. We will see remarkable portrayals of the minds of villains. We will see erotic tension, conflict between children and parents, explosive scandal scenes, and more. For a novel as artistically clumsy as this one, it is pregnant with ideas that will find brilliant expression in the great works ahead. And this completes our Let's Discuss. I hope you found these ideas to be of value. Certainly, to the extent that you feel they need correction or completion, you are welcome to improve upon them in the comments section below. I thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the experience.